extra. That's the word, extra. A baseline is a starting point or a basis of comparison for something. And so that's your baseline. Kind of imagine that a little bit. Anything more would be considered extra. Now, Jesus spoke of going the second mile voluntarily, was his implication, or the implication in what he said when he was preaching to the record we find in Matthew 5:41. I'm turning there. I'll bring out the the point that he made. But we are to go the extra mile We'll try this again. Jesus spoke of going the second mile voluntarily when one was compelled to go 1 mile. And that was possible because in Rome, with over 50,000 miles of roads throughout that area, the Mediterranean, they had mile markers every mile. People, Roman citizens or a soldier, could compel a subject of some of those conquered lands to carry his backpack or load or other things for a mile, but only for a mile. You weren't required to go any further than that, so you could pretty well mark it. If you went a mile, all right, my job's done. Christ is saying, if you're compelled to go the mile, go the extra mile. Add that help. It's a great principle about doing something extra. Going above and beyond what is expected or making a bigger effort than what is required certainly is something that Christians should always try to do. We are responsible to follow fundamental requirements, and we'll be doing that here very shortly during this Feast of Pentecost, and that is to come with an offering to God. And that understanding, the reason we do this is based on, of course, the Bible, but Deuteronomy 16:16 pretty well summarizes the point. God has us bring an offering on all of his annual holy days. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, where we find ourselves now, and at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. That's, or empty-handed, as it actually says in the verse. And it's a general presentation of the annual holy days into 3 different time segments. Spring, then the time we're in now, and then the fall, which will include more, for a total of 7. As servants of God, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing what we're doing today, is appearing before God in the place that he set his name. And we assemble before God with an offering. We come prepared with something in our hand, as God commands us to do. But how much of an offering should we bring? There's the consideration we all face throughout these times when we give an offering. I'd like you to consider some principles from the Bible. Of course, underlying all of this is the concept of how do we do a little bit extra. We understand that if we have a meal, we can give a little bit extra. It's our discretion. It's called a tip. It's not quite the same thing I'm talking about here today, but I think we're used to the idea that we can be in situations where we can do more than what's required. We could walk out of the restaurant just paying the bill. Of course, you probably have a flying tackle as you didn't, but that's how rough these times have come. But Consider these principles. 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 7. So let each one give, 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 7, as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity. Oh, I have to give an offering today. Oh. For God loves a cheerful giver. But the key thing for us to consider here, it's our discretion, our choice. What have we proposed? What have we planned to give to God from the heart? And the best way to do that is to plan ahead. You know, we know that throughout the year we're going to be giving offerings. We can plan those offerings in advance, which is a lot more successful a lot of times than waiting till the last moment. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 17 now. We had read verse 16 of Deuteronomy 16. In verse 17, every man shall give as he is able. I'm talking about how much of an offering we should give. Every man shall give as he is able, according, now here's something to consider as well, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. Has God blessed you this past year, this past week, this day? I mean, we consider these things as we reflect on whether we give a little, which we may only be able to do, or if we can, in a position where we can maybe do a little bit more, something extra. In conjunction with what I'm talking about here, though, we have an additional consideration. Luke 17 and verse 10. Luke 17 and verse 10. So likewise, you, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, and this is Christ's instruction here, when you've done everything, you've got it all tied up neatly, we're to say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. Yes, we come with an offering today, and God honors that. That's part of the command. We can also understand that we can approach it with, if nothing more, learn to have the desire to come rejoicing, being a cheerful giver. And the way you can be a cheerful giver is being able to fulfill what God commands with a little bit more, like Christ is talking about here. Profit does not begin until the servant goes beyond what is required. When something extra is offered in service. 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 6. Another underlying principle here about what I'm talking about giving an offering. 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Is your offering down to the half cent? Well, if you only have half cents, yeah, that's fine. Consider the example of the woman who, though she was poor, gave her whole life's holdings. And Christ called that out as an example for all time. And she was depending on God for her future. That doesn't happen often, but there were reasons, I'm sure, why that all came together as it did. But let me read now the full verse here. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Brethren, that's a promise from God. Try it. You know, you've heard the saying before, you cannot outgive God. Try it. He has some things to say about a nation who has stolen from him, how he challenges them to turn back to tithing, and I'll open up the windows of heaven so that you can't contain the blessings. I've known people, I've experienced it personally, where sometimes the blessings just come in waves and heaps. Just have to remember, I didn't do much to deserve that, except the most important thing, I think, for what we're talking about now is we obey God, and then we see how much more we can obey him. So how can we give bountifully? I'd just like to conclude with 3 points quickly. As we prepare our offerings to God, plan to provide something extra. It's something you have to think about. You have to make a conscious decision on. Second Corinthians 8 and verse 12. And, as you plan to provide something extra, I would advise that we ask God for help to be able to do it. Keep God engaged in this process all along. Ask God. See what he will do to provide an opportunity for you to make a decision and have the opportunity to fulfill that. 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 12, for if there is a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. I'm not talking about giving extra on the basis that you're giving something you don't have. That's not what God expects. He wants to see the attitude. In the parable of the talents, we know that some did more than others. And those who increased all got extra blessings. Those who stayed and did only what was required, or he who only did that, didn't turn out so well. Then consider a second point, how God has blessed us. Weigh that into the factor of giving. Has he blessed us? Reflect that. It's a way of saying thank you. And then third and finally, make it a goal to be a profitable servant. Think about that. I want to be like Paul, sets the great example of that. When we see, I think of beyond Jesus Christ himself, we'd have to look to Paul, David perhaps, in terms of how he prepared for the building of the temple. Even though he didn't get to build it, he was prohibited from building it. But can I get some gold, some big stones, some timber? Well, yes, he was able to do that. But his zeal and his passion for serving God and giving to God, make it a goal to be a profitable servant, doing extra things in our service to him, not only in our offerings, but in all aspects of our lives. How can me, whether I'm 10 or 15 or 18 or 80, careful here now, what can I do to make it a little bit more? How can I serve God more zealously and really be a profitable servant?